The sun rose lazily over Chicago as Michelangelo passed through the gates of Lincoln Elementary School. His footsteps echoed through the still empty hallways as they had every morning for the past 15 years. At 42, he maintained an almost clockwork routine. He always arrived an hour before classes began to organize his materials and enjoy the silence he cherished so much. On that March morning in 2024, however, something felt different. An inexplicable restlessness had followed him since he woke up. As he arranged the day's activities on his desk, his hands trembled slightly, and a heaviness in his chest unsettled him. It must be the weather, he thought, glancing out the window at the overcast sky that promised yet another rainy day. In the city. "Mr. Michael, you're early today." The cheerful voice of Mrs. Josephine, the school's longest-serving custodian, interrupted his thoughts. She stopped at the classroom door, leaning on her broom, with that smile that could light up any room. "As always, Mrs. Josephine," he replied, trying to mask the growing discomfort in his chest. "You're the one who's becoming more of an early bird every day." "Ah, Mr. Michael, you know. Ever since I joined that prayer group I told you about, it feels like I have more energy. You should show up one of these days." Michael smiled politely. He had always admired Mrs. Josephine's unshakable faith, even if he didn't share it. As a science teacher, his mind was more inclined toward rational explanations than spiritual matters. Still, something about her words that particular morning made him hesitate. "Maybe one day, Mrs. Josephine," he replied, feeling a sharper pang in his chest. The following hours passed like a blur in his memory. The lesson on the solar system for the 6th grade, the curious questions from students about black holes, the noisy recess in the courtyard. Michael carried on with his routine, ignoring the signals his body was sending, until during the last class of the day, the world began to spin. "Professor, are you okay?" asked Emily Grace, one of his most attentive students, noticing the paleness on his face. "I just need," his voice faltered. The classroom began to darken at the edges of his vision. The chalk slipped from his fingers, breaking on the floor with a crack that seemed to echo for an eternity. The student's shout sounded distant as his body collapsed. Amid flashes of consciousness, Michael heard frantic voices, felt hands moving him, and heard sirens. At some point, Mrs. Josephine's voice stood out among all the others. "My God, protect our teacher." It was his last memory before the void. At St. Luke's Hospital, the medical team worked frantically. "Massive pulmonary embolism," declared Dr. Robert Miller as monitors beeped furiously. "We need to act fast." Time seemed to move differently in that emergency room. For the doctors and nurses fighting to save Michael's life, every second was precious. For Michael, however, time had ceased to exist entirely. At some point during those critical 33 minutes and 27 seconds when his heart stopped beating, something extraordinary happened. While his family was notified and Mrs. Josephine organized a prayer chain in the hospital chapel, Michael began a journey that would change not only his life, but his entire understanding of reality. The heart monitor showed a flatline, but Michael's consciousness traveled beyond the boundaries of the physical world. He was about to discover truths that would challenge everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the power of faith. In the waiting room, her sister Megan arrived breathless, still wearing the dental office coat from where she worked. Her red eyes betrayed the tears she had held back during the entire journey to the hospital. Beside her, Mrs. Josephine held a rosary between her gnarled fingers, her lips moving in silent prayer. "He's going to be okay," whispered Mrs. Josephine, holding Megan's hand. "God won't let our teacher go like this." What neither of them knew was that, at that very moment, Michael was experiencing something that would forever transform his understanding of life, death, and the true power of prayer that Mrs. Josephine so deeply valued. The first sensation was one of lightness, a lightness so absolute that Michael felt as if all the weight he had carried throughout his life, worries, fears, responsibilities, had simply dissolved. There was no more pain, no more of that chest tightness that had tormented him all day. When he opened his eyes, were they really eyes, he found himself enveloped by a light that, paradoxically, was intense, yet not blinding. It was as if he were immersed in an ocean of radiance that not only surrounded him, but also flowed through him. The colors he saw could not be described in earthly words. They were hues that transcended the known visible spectrum. Where am I?" thought Michael, realizing he no longer needed words to express himself. His thoughts seemed to echo in the very environment, creating ripples in the light that surrounded him. It was then that he saw her, a manifestation of energy so pure and radiant that his first reaction was complete awe. It had no defined shape, but it emanated a presence that conveyed unconditional love and a wisdom as ancient as the universe itself. "Welcome, Michael." The voice was not a sound but a vibration that resonated in every particle of his being. "Do not fear, you are safe here." Thousands of questions sprang to his mind simultaneously, but before he could articulate any of them, the luminous presence began to show him something extraordinary. The space around him transformed, and Michael found himself observing Earth from a completely new perspective. It was as if he could see two realities superimposed, the physical world he knew and a spiritual dimension that permeated it entirely. And then he saw them, the prayers. Each plea, each supplication, each thanksgiving manifested as threads of light rising from Earth, creating a luminous web that enveloped the entire planet. "Observe," said the presence, and Michael saw with increasing clarity how each prayer generated waves of energy that propagated far beyond their point of origin. A mother praying for her sick child in Miami created a protective field that not only enveloped the child, but extended, positively affecting the entire hospital. A group of people praying in a small church in New Orleans generated a force that repelled dark entities wandering the streets. "But how is this possible?" asked Michael, amazed. "I always thought prayer was just a ritual, a tradition." The presence completed with something Michael perceived as a transcendental form of tenderness. Prayer is the language of the soul, Michael. It is the most powerful force given to humanity, though few understand its true nature. The vision expanded, and Michael could see the strategies of negative forces to prevent people from praying. He saw how they created distractions, fueled fatigue, generated apparent urgencies, all to keep people away from the practice of prayer. "See how even the smallest prayer has power," the presence showed him. Michael observed a child saying a simple prayer before bed. The little guardian angel prayer generated a light that not only protected their sleep, but created a shield that extended over their entire family, warding off negative influences lurking around the house. Every prayer, no matter how simple it may seem, is a declaration of connection with the divine, the presence explained. It is an act of alignment with the forces of light, harmony, and love. As he observed, Michael began to understand why so many people felt discouraged from praying. He saw the doubts, the skepticism, the rush of modern life, all subtle strategies to keep humanity disconnected from its most fundamental spiritual power. "But why are you showing me all this?" Michael questioned, still absorbing the magnitude of what he was witnessing. "Because you have a role to fulfill, Michael," the presence replied. "You have been chosen to be a bridge between these dimensions, to help people understand the true power they possess through prayer." Michael felt a wave of responsibility and at the same time, gratitude. All his previous certainties, his scientific skepticism now seemed like such a limited view of reality. True science, he realized, was just a glimpse into the divine complexity of the universe. The presence then began to show him how prayers spanned generations. He saw prayers made by ancestors protecting their descendants, prayers from mothers, creating fields of protection that lasted for decades, blessings that multiplied through time like waves in an infinite ocean. In the hospital, as the doctors continued their efforts to revive him, time marched on inexorably. But for Michael, immersed in that timeless dimension, each revelation was an eternity of understanding and discovery. The first sound Michael heard upon returning was the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the fluorescent light of the hospital room. The sensation was strange, like putting on a heavy suit again after floating freely in space. "He's waking up!" His sister Megan's excited voice sounded nearby. "Doctor! Nurse!" Michael blinked a few times, trying to focus his vision. The colors of the physical world seemed so limited now. He could still feel echoes of that other dimension, like a lingering perfume even after its source had been removed. Dr. Robert Miller quickly approached the bed, checking the vital signs with a barely concealed look of astonishment. "Mr. Michael, you gave us quite a scare. Your heart was stopped for over 33 minutes. To be precise, 33 minutes and 27 seconds. It's extraordinary that you're here with us, with no apparent neurological damage." Michael tried to speak, but his throat was dry. A nurse approached with a glass of water, helping him drink through a straw. Each sip was a rediscovery of physical sensations. "Mrs. Josephine," he managed to murmur after a few moments. "She's in the chapel," Megan replied, wiping away tears. "She hasn't left since I need to talk to her," Michael insisted, trying to sit up. "Easy, Professor," the doctor gently restrained him. "You've just been through an extremely serious experience. You need to rest." But how could he rest? His mind was overflowing with everything he had experienced, with the truths he had uncovered. He felt an almost physical urgency to share, to tell everyone about what he had witnessed. "You don't understand," Ethan insisted, his voice growing stronger. I need to tell." Megan and the doctor exchanged worried glances, likely interpreting his agitation as a sign of post-traumatic confusion. But Ethan had never been more lucid in his entire life. At that moment, Mrs. Josephine entered the room, her rosary still in her hands. Their eyes met, and Ethan saw something he had never noticed before, a soft aura surrounding her, a result of her constant prayers. "I saw Mrs. Josephine," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I saw the power you always spoke of." The caretaker approached the bed, holding his hand firmly. She showed no surprise or disbelief, only a deep and silent understanding. "I know, Professor," she replied softly. "I always knew that one day you would understand." In the days that followed, Michael remained in the hospital for a full battery of tests. The doctors were especially puzzled by the absence of brain damage after such a long period without oxygen. From a scientific standpoint, it was practically impossible. During this time, he began to notice things that had previously gone unnoticed. He could see, though not as clearly as during his experience, the effects of prayers in the hospital. Environment. He noticed how the room felt lighter after Mrs. Josephine visited, how the atmosphere shifted when someone prayed silently in the hallway. Megan, always so pragmatic, observed the changes in her brother with a mix of relief and concern. "You're different, Michael," she commented one afternoon as she helped him with lunch. "I'm better, Megan. Better than I've ever been," he replied, realizing it would be difficult to explain the depth of his transformation. How could he describe that he now saw the world in multiple layers, that he understood reality in a way that transcended language itself? "Don't worry so much," he smiled, seeing the concerned expression on his sister's face. "Some changes are for the better." During the nights at the hospital, when silence dominated the hallways, Michael began to write. Page after page of notes about everything he had experienced, trying to find words to describe the indescribable. He knew he needed to share this message, but how could he do it without sounding like someone who had lost their mind? 2 weeks later, Michael was finally discharged from the hospital. The return home was a surreal experience. Everything seemed both familiar and completely new at the same time. His small apartment in the Lapa neighborhood of Chicago was exactly as he had left it, but his perception of the space was entirely different. "Are you sure you don't want to stay with me for a few days?" asked Megan, placing a grocery bag on the kitchen counter. "I don't like the idea of you being alone after everything that's happened." "I need this time, sis," replied Michael, noticing how the evening light now created different patterns, as if it carried messages he couldn't read before. "I have a lot to process." Megan hesitated at the door, biting her lower lip, a childhood habit that always betrayed her concern. "Are you really going back to teaching next week? Don't you think it's too soon?" "I've never been more certain about anything," he replied with a conviction that even surprised himself. My students need me now more than ever. After Megan left, Michael sat in his favorite armchair and closed his eyes. The silence of the apartment was filled with a peace he now recognized as the constant presence of the divine. He picked up his notebook and began organizing his thoughts. How could he integrate what he had learned in his science classes? How could he show his students that there was no contradiction between scientific knowledge and the spiritual dimension of existence? More importantly, how could he demonstrate the transformative power of prayer without seeming like he had turned into a religious fanatic? The next morning, his phone rang early. It was Mrs. Josephine. "Professor, I'm sorry to call so early, but I need to tell you something." Her voice was filled with emotion. "You know that prayer group I always invited you to join? Well, last night during our meeting, I had a vision. I saw you speaking to a crowd, sharing an important message. People were crying and their lives were being transformed." Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. This confirmed what he already knew. In his heart, there was a greater purpose behind everything that had happened. "Mrs. Josephine," he replied after a moment of silence, "I think it's time for me to meet this prayer group of yours." The first meeting of the group was held in a small church in the Bronx, a simple but welcoming place. When Michael walked in, he immediately felt the energy of the space. It was as if he could see the years of prayers embedded in the very walls. The group was small, just 15 people, but Michael could sense the strength of their collective prayers. As Mrs. Josephine introduced him, he noticed how each person there carried their own light, their own story of faith and transformation. "Everyone," he began when it was his turn to speak. "A few weeks ago, I was a different man, a science teacher, who believed only in what could be proven in a lab. But God has an interesting way of changing our perspectives. And so, for the first time, Michael shared his experience publicly. He spoke about the 33 minutes and 27 seconds he had been clinically dead. He described the light, the divine presence, the revelations about the power of prayer. As he spoke, he could see how deeply his words touched everyone present. "What I discovered," he continued, his voice choked with emotion, "is that every prayer we make has a far greater power than we can imagine. It is not just a request or a thank you. It is a real force that transforms the spiritual world and consequently our physical world." At the end of his account, the silence in the room was palpable. Then an elderly woman at the back of the room stood up, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "My son," she said, "for 30 years, I have prayed every day for my son who is lost to drugs. Many times I thought of giving up, believing it was pointless, but today your words have given me hope again." The news about the teacher who had returned from death with a special message began to spread quickly. First among the members of the prayer group, then throughout the local community, and soon Michael found himself receiving invitations to share his experience at other churches and spiritual study groups. His return to school was also remarkable. The students, who already admired him before, now looked at him with even greater curiosity. Michael realized he needed to find a balance between his role as a science teacher and his new understanding of spiritual reality. "Professor, is it true that you saw angels?" asked Ethan, one of his most curious students, during a lesson about the solar system. Michael smiled, carefully considering how to respond. "The universe is far more complex than we can imagine, Ethan. Science helps us understand a part of it, but there are dimensions that go beyond what our instruments can measure." In his classes, Michael began subtly integrating his new perspective. When he spoke about energy, for example, he mentioned how everything in the universe is interconnected. When discussing the laws of physics, he emphasized how much science still cannot explain. One day, after one of his classes, Principal Helen called him into her office. "Ethan, I need to be frank with you," she began, her tone revealing concern. "Some parents have reached out, worried about the direction of your classes. They say you're mixing religion with science." "Helen," he replied calmly, "I'm just showing the students that scientific knowledge and spirituality are not mutually exclusive. I'm still teaching the regular curriculum, just expanding horizons." The principal observed him for a moment, thoughtful. "You know, Ethan, my daughter was in the hospital the same day as you. She told me about an inexplicable peace she felt. When Mrs. Josephine was praying in the chapel, At the time, I didn't think much of it, but now, meanwhile, invitations for lectures were multiplying. Michael began speaking at community centers, schools, and churches of various denominations. His message transcended religious barriers. He didn't speak about specific dogmas or doctrines, but about the universal power of prayer. One Sunday, after speaking to a particularly large group at a downtown church, Michael was approached by a journalist from the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS. "Professor Michael," she introduced herself, "your name has been circulating a lot lately. We'd like to do a special feature on your experience and the message you've been sharing. What strikes me is how you're able to connect with both religious individuals and skeptics alike." The segment aired a week later, and the impact was immediate. Michael's phone wouldn't stop ringing, his email overflowed with messages, and his social media exploded with requests for contact. "Michael, you need to be careful," Megan warned, concerned about her brother's growing exposure. "There are a lot of people out there who want to take advantage of stories like yours." "I know, sis," he replied, gazing out the window of his apartment at the city lights. "But I also know this message needs to be shared. Don't you see? People are thirsty for hope, for a deeper connection with the divine." With the growing exposure came challenges as well. While many received his message with gratitude and openness, others reacted with skepticism and even hostility. On a debate show on TV, Michael faced his first major public test. "Professor Michael," began the interviewer, a well-known skeptical commentator, "you were a man of science. How do you explain this sudden conversion to mysticism after an experience that, let's face it, could easily be explained by chemical changes in the brain during the dying process?" Michael took a deep breath before responding, recalling the peace he had felt in that dimension beyond life. "Look, I haven't abandoned science. In fact, my experience has expanded my understanding of reality. Science teaches us that only 5% of the universe is composed of visible matter. The rest is dark energy and dark matter, which we cannot see or measure directly. Why would it be so hard to accept that there are dimensions of reality beyond our common perception?" The debate continued heatedly, but Michael's calmness and clarity impressed even his most ardent critics. His ability to maintain a respectful dialogue without abandoning his convictions began to catch the attention of influential people. It was during this period that Michael received an unexpected invitation. A prominent university wanted him to participate in a study on near-death experiences. At first he hesitated. He didn't want his experience to be reduced to mere statistical data, but then he remembered how his own journey had begun with skepticism. "I agree to participate in the study under one condition," he replied to Dr. Beatrice Sanders, the research coordinator. "I want you to also study the impact of prayer on people who practice it regularly." The doctor hesitated for a moment before responding. "That would be an interesting complementary study. We could measure physiological changes during the act of prayer, brain patterns, hormone levels, and also the effects on the people who receive the prayers," added Michael. "We need a holistic approach." The study began to take shape, attracting interest from researchers in different fields. While sensors measured his brainwaves, Michael shared details of his experience that he had never mentioned publicly. "It's fascinating," commented Dr. Beatrice, analyzing the preliminary results. "Your brain patterns during the recollection of the experience are unique, and the results from the prayer group are equally intriguing." Amid all this excitement, however, something unexpected happened. During one of his regular lectures, Michael met Claire, a young psychologist who had lost her faith after years of working with terminal patients. "How do you manage to maintain such certainty?" she asked him after a particularly moving lecture. "I've seen so much suffering, so many seemingly unanswered prayers." The encounter with Claire sparked a deep reflection in Michael. He realized he needed to address not only the power of prayer, but also the mystery of when answers seem absent. Their conversations became increasingly frequent. She brought up questions that pushed him to think beyond his personal experience, forcing him to explore deeper aspects of what he had lived through. "You know, Michael," Claire said during a coffee break after another study session at the university, "I've started noticing something interesting about my patients. Those who develop a regular prayer practice regardless of religion, seem to handle the treatment process better. Michael smiled, recognizing in her words an echo of the truths he had witnessed. Prayer isn't about asking for miracles, Claire. It's about establishing a connection with something greater than ourselves. Meanwhile, the study at the university began yielding surprising results. The data showed significant changes not only in those who prayed, but also in the environment around them. Ultrasensitive equipment detected subtle energy variations during group prayer sessions. "This is extraordinary," commented Dr. Richard Mendes, a quantum physicist who joined the research. "We are observing patterns that challenge our current understanding of physics." It was during one of these research sessions that Michael had a new revelation. While the devices measured his brainwaves, he entered a deep state of meditation and had a vision that complemented his previous experience. He saw how prayers not only created light on the spiritual plane, but also wove a protective network around the planet. It was as if each sincere prayer added a thread to a cosmic tapestry of love and healing. "We need to expand the study," he told the research team after sharing his vision. "There is something happening on a global scale, something that transcends our religious and cultural differences." Claire, who was closely following the entire process, began to notice changes within herself. "It's strange," she confessed to Michael during one of their meetings. "The more time I spend involved in this research, the more I feel something awakening inside me. A hope I thought I had lost." Mrs. Josephine's prayer group had also grown significantly. What had started with 15 people now gathered over 100, and their collective prayers generated impressive readings on the university's equipment. "Ethan," called Mrs. Josephine after one of these meetings, "I need to tell you something. I had another vision, stronger than the first. I saw you in front of an immense crowd, in a moment of great tribulation, but I also saw danger, forces, that want to stop your message from spreading." Mrs. Josephine's warning soon proved prophetic. With the preliminary release of the research findings, Ethan began to face more organized opposition. Skeptical groups launched a campaign to discredit him, suggesting it was all an elaborate fraud. "Professor claims to have died and returned. Science or charlatanism?" blared the headline of a sensationalist newspaper. The article questioned his mental sanity and suggested he was manipulating data to promote a religious agenda. "Don't let this shake you," advised Claire, who was now always by his side. "They attack because they're afraid of what they can't explain." But the real test came when a group of rival researchers published a paper suggesting that near-death experiences were merely hallucinations caused by a lack of oxygen in the brain. The media quickly picked up the story, and Ethan found himself at the center of a storm. "Professor," called Ethan after a particularly challenging class where some students had made hurtful comments, "I believe in you. My grandmother was in the hospital, almost giving up on her cancer treatment. After I started telling her your stories about the power of prayer, she completely changed. The doctors don't understand how she's improving so quickly." Stories like Ethan's began to multiply. While some tried to discredit his message, others shared profound experiences of transformation. The contrast couldn't be greater. It was during this time that Michael had a bold idea. "What if we held a public event?" he proposed during a meeting with the research team. "Not just a lecture, but a practical demonstration of the power of collective prayer with all the available measurement equipment." The proposal sparked heated debate. Some researchers feared that a negative result could jeopardize the entire study. Others argued that it was exactly the kind of public experiment science needed. "It would be a huge risk," pondered Dr. Richard Mendes. Richard, but also a unique opportunity to document something extraordinary. Claire, who had become an important voice within the team, supported the idea. "If we want people to truly understand, we need to show it in a way they can't deny." The preparation for the event began amid great anticipation. The university provided the sports gymnasium, capable of accommodating thousands of people. Sophisticated equipment was installed to measure energy variations, electromagnetic fields, and the brain patterns of participants. The media, of course, had a field day with the announcement. "Professor promises to scientifically prove the power of prayer," the newspapers proclaimed. Social media buzzed with heated debates between skeptics and supporters. On the eve of the event, Michael received an unexpected visit at his apartment. It was a man who introduced himself as a representative of a major religious institution. "Professor," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "we are concerned about the direction your activities are taking. Mystical experiences should remain in the realm of faith, not science. I suggest you reconsider this public event." The veiled threat was clear, but Ethan remained steadfast. "What I saw and experienced transcends any religious institution. It is a truth that belongs to all humanity." The day of the event dawned with a different energy in Chicago. Early in the morning, people began to gather in front of the university gymnasium. There were people of all ages and social classes, some traveling from other states to participate. "It's incredible," commented Claire, observing the crowd from the window of the makeshift office, where the team was making final preparations. "I've never seen anything like this at a scientific event." Dr. Richard Mendez was overseeing the final installation of the equipment: thermal cameras, electromagnetic field sensors, electroencephalographs, every kind of device that could record any measurable change during the experiment. Mrs. Josephine arrived early with her prayer group, now expanded to include people from different religions. "Professor," she called out to Ethan before he took the stage, "remember what you saw on the other side. No matter what happens today, the truth is greater than any scientific proof." The gymnasium was completely packed when Ethan finally took the stage. Thousands of people waited in silent anticipation. TV cameras broadcast the event live across the country. "Today," he began, his voice echoing through the sound system, "we are not here to prove or deny anything. We are here to experience together something that transcends our divisions and prejudices, something I discovered in the most unexpected way possible, through 33 minutes and 27 seconds on the other side of the veil of death." The silence in the gymnasium was palpable as Michael guided the crowd through a unique experience. First, he asked everyone to close their eyes and take a deep breath. Then he instructed them to focus on a positive intention, a simple and sincere prayer. In the control room, the researchers watched the monitors in awe. "This is incredible," whispered Dr. Richard, pointing to the readings. "The energy patterns are spontaneously synchronizing." Claire, who was monitoring another set of equipment, noticed something even more extraordinary. "Look at this," she called out, indicating a series of graphs. "The amplitude of the participants' brainwaves. They are entering resonance." On stage, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced since his near-death encounter. It was as if a very thin veil was lifting, allowing him to glimpse that other dimension once again. "Now," his voice trembled slightly with emotion, "I want each of you to visualize your prayer as a light. A light that expands, that connects with the lights around you." It was at that moment that it happened. First, a lady in the front row gasped, opening her eyes. Then others began to murmur in awe. Even those who kept their eyes closed could feel it. A presence, an indescribable energy filling the space. The equipment began to record unprecedented readings. Thermal cameras showed energy patterns scientists had never seen before. Electromagnetic field sensors triggered overload alerts. "It's exactly as you described," whispered Claire, who had stepped onto the stage to stand beside Michael. Tears streamed down her face as she watched the extraordinary phenomenon unfolding before them. The light Michael had witnessed during his near-death experience was now manifesting in a way others could perceive. It wasn't a physical light, but a luminescence that seemed to emanate from the very soul of those present. Mrs. Josephine, in her corner of the gym, smiled serenely. She had always known this moment would come, the moment when the barrier between the visible and the invisible would grow thinner, allowing others to experience what she had always known in her heart. When the event finally ended hours later, no one wanted to leave. People hugged, cried, and shared their experiences. Scientists rushed back and forth, trying to process the staggering amount of data collected. "This goes far beyond any conventional scientific explanation," admitted Dr. Richard, still haunted by what he had witnessed. "It will take us years to fully understand what happened here today." In the days that followed, the repercussions of the event spread across the world. Headlines in every newspaper, heated debates on television, endless analyses of the data collected. But for Michael, the most important thing wasn't the scientific evidence. The true miracle, he explained in his final public lecture months later, isn't in the data or the measurements. It's in the transformation that occurs when we recognize our connection to the divine, when we understand that every prayer is a bridge between dimensions, a portal of light we can open at any moment. Claire, now his partner in life and work, had developed a research program combining psychology and spirituality. Mrs. Josephine continued with her prayer group, which had transformed into a study center on the power of prayer. And Michael? He returned to teaching, but now with a new mission. In his words, "Science shows us how the universe works, but prayer connects us to why it exists. And when we unite the two, we discover that we are all part of something much greater, a grand portal of light that is always open to those who have eyes to see and a heart to feel." The experience in the gymnasium was just the beginning. What Michael started that day continues to expand, touching lives and transforming how people understand the connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. His story reminds us that sometimes it takes dying for 33 minutes and 27 seconds to discover the true meaning of being alive.